What is culture? Um, it's complicated. It's hard working with humans. Being a human is hard. Ugh, this is such a loaded question.
Welcome, Shereen. We're so happy
Hey,
to have you. Nice to see you. How are you doing today?
I'm wonderful. Even better being with you too. How are you? Both.
Shereen, so we have known you for I guess a little while, a few years, but you know what? I don't know if Tuli knows this, but I don't really know your story of how you got into what you're doing. Like I don't know your journey. So we'd love first, like, can you tell us a little bit about who is Shereen and how you got here?
Yeah, loaded question. Who am I? So I'll start with how I got here because
Okay.
who am I is a really loaded question. So I obviously met in the Northwestern program. I'll tell you how I got there. So I majored in psychology in college. I really only did that because I had no idea what I wanted to do and I was running out of majors or I was running out of prereqs and my counselor was like, you have to pick a major, you need to take a break from school. And I was like, I guess I should pick a major. So I decided I was going to do psychology because I thought I wanted to be a child psychologist. And then I realized I have overactive tear ducts and I could never sit in front of a child who was like expressing any problems without crying. So I was like, sharp pivot, definitely can't do that.
Wow.
Yeah.
At what point did you discover that? Did you have like an internship or something, and children were talking to you and you?
No, no. I just honestly like I watch like Fox and the Hound and I would like cry for a week. Or like I watch American Idol. If I watch The Voice, goodbye. If, like four chairs turn around, I'll be sobbing like beside myself. And those are like happy moments. So I'm like, forget the sad moments. There's like no way I could do this. Even a kid, if a kid was like, I have the best life, I'd probably be sobbing. So I was like,
Oh,
I cannot do this. So great start. So I graduate and when I was an undergrad, I did not do any sort of like research in psychology, which obviously a lot of people who wanted to get a master's in it had done that. So I applied for a research position at the University of Michigan in really like supporting PhD students in org change. And so I did that for a year. And it was essentially 40 hours a week of just reading like white papers and HBR articles and coding. And then we would meet for 1 hour a week to collaborate. And after doing that for a year, as introverted as I am, I was like, get me as far away from this as humanly possible. And so my mom was like, you're lost. And I was like, I'm lost. That is an accurate statement. So
thanks,
I,
Mom.
yeah, she's like, I'm going to get you a career coach. And I was like, sure, sounds great.
Mm.
So I got a career coach, and I like to say, like a lot of lost souls, I ended up in marketing and advertising, which at the time I was like, I'm so cool. I was like working on Coca-Cola. I was getting Starbucks every morning, like had no concept of anything. I just was like living the dream life, working at an agency, whatever.
Very busy, right? You were very busy all the time.
So busy. Like so yeah, and just like I thought I was so cool. And I would go into the office like a couple of times. I went in on Saturday and I was like, I'm the hardest working person on the planet. And then I was like, this is not for me. And I ended up moving to Chicago. I stayed with that company, but when I got to Chicago after like 6 months, got a new job also in marketing and technology and did that for a couple years. And then I really started to realize that like I did not love the work, but I liked the people aspect of it. Like I knew everything about my teammates and I was always like, asking them questions about like, what do they want to work on? What do you like? And so I was talking to a friend about it and she was like, you should look at this Northwestern program. So I was like, okay, sounds great. So
Mm.
looked into it. And she was like, basically like an MBA, but like getting the work done through people. And despite having like researched a lot of that when I was at U of M, I must have like blocked that out because it was a whole new concept to me. I was like, wait, there's like work where you can just care about people, but like help them drive the business. And so I applied for Northwestern and I did not tell a soul because I had really bad imposter syndrome. And then I got in and then my whole life changed. And that was,
and this, we should say this is, I mean, just for those of those, you know, those thousands of you who are not part of the program that all three of us went to, this is the master's in learning and organizational change at Northwestern University.
yes. Yeah. So I started that in January of 19. I got my certificate, my coaching certificate while I was doing the program, graduated from that in March of 2020. And then March of 21, I graduated from the master's program. And at the time I was still lost, like no idea what I'm going to do. I was still working at that technology company. And somebody from the program, Lindsay, approached me and asked me if I wanted to start a business with her doing coaching. And I was like, me? Like, you want to start a business with me? And she's like, yes, I would like to do that. And so we were going to start doing coaching. And we actually got, we were going through our final class together in, I think it was January. It was a practicum and we did a culture analysis for Facebook through like the 460 class. And we got to like design a culture survey and interview them. And I had just completed my capstone research on culture. And so we were like, we totally love this work. This is very cool. This is absolutely something we could do. So we started doing that. We were doing a little bit of coaching. And then we had this like really big dream that when we finally made it, we would start doing workshops. And now, honestly, the majority of the stuff that I do is workshops. Okay. So yeah, we were like, we definitely needed bigger, scarier dreams. Yeah, since February of 21, I have really been doing the whole entrepreneur thing and everything that we built. Now I'm doing it alone. Lindsay took a step back from the business. She's still a consultant to the business and she's wonderful in all the things. It really came from like a lot of the pain that we had experienced at organizations. So culture analysis was, how do we hear all of the voices of people at organizations? So instead of like leadership solving problems in a vacuum, how can we understand what's going on at the bottom? Why is this happening? How do we hear from everybody? And then from like a workshops and courses perspective, when I got promoted to first time manager, I was so lost. And it's such a weird time because you go from like having lunch with people who then start reporting to you the next day. And it's just a very weird transition. And we had some development, but it wasn't this like very thorough, long, you know, course. Then they're sort of like, okay, you're off to the races. And I was like, no, yeah, this is like not going very well for me. So we built that. And then now we have this Gen Z course, which I'm sure we're going to get into more details about Gen Z, but that's my story of how I ended up here. Now it's been 2 years of being an entrepreneur, which is such a weird word that I still am like, am I? But I am.
That's great. I mean, yeah, you're doing the thing. You're an organizational consultant. You teach workshops. You're doing culture stuff, assessment surveys, all that. It's great. Yeah,
not sitting in front of kids and crying. So definitely was a better course for me.
Do you ever cry while conducting a culture?
I have cried on the way home from workshops before because I've been like so happy, but not from like culture stuff, but I've just been like so fulfilled. Like one time I had to pull over on the side of the road. I was like really crying. It was a lot.
That's cool.
Yeah. It was a very weird. I was like, what is wrong with me? And then I was like, I cannot get onto the highway like this. So I have to pull over and just like let it out and carry on with my life. So yeah.
Amazing. I have a bunch of questions here, but I want to start with this. You mentioned before, I believe you mentioned that you were an introvert. You also give workshops. That's a lot of what you do. You know a lot of people, I think, at least. I'm just curious what you mean by an introvert.
Yeah, I think more so like I mean, Alma's probably not surprised to hear that, but just really like I really truly do get energy from being alone. Like I know extroverts need their alone time, but like I could be left alone for 2 weeks and I would be so happy. So after I run workshops, I truly, like, best kept secret, I have to take a nap. I'm like, I've given all of my energy away. And it's amazing and I love it, but like it does take a lot out of me.
Mm.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and okay, so let's move to culture for a second. We talked a little bit about culture, organization. What is culture?
What is culture? Simply put, culture is the way that we do things around here.
Thank you for the shoulder movements.
Yeah.
I would like to point that out to those of you who are only listening. Shereen
Yeah.
moved her shoulders around.
Yeah. The way
I think in the MBA they call that a shimmy. No.
Yeah.
Oh, shimmy, shimmy.
You learned this at MSLC. No, I think it's, I mean, it's funny because I say like, it's the way we do things around here, but I really do think that's the easiest way of explaining what it is. It's like when we say things like artifacts and it's like, what is that? So I think it's, when I walk in, I learn what's right, what's wrong, what's appropriate, what's not, what type of behavior gets rewarded. What is, there's one thing to have the talk, but like the walk is the culture. So that's sort of how I think about everything that's happening within an organization.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. And do you find, so when you go into an organization and you do a culture assessment, do you find that they, like organizational leaders, are pretty aware of what their culture is, or are they generally surprised to learn certain things about their culture?
I think it depends. I would say the companies that are really in tune with it, first of all, I would say have a more proactive approach. So instead of saying like, we have high attrition, we need you to come do a culture analysis, they're like, we want to get a pulse on what's going on. A lot of times those companies will already have like a list of priorities and a pretty good idea of like what they might need to improve on. And when we run the culture analysis, sometimes it helps them reprioritize things. So they might be like, oh, that wasn't like priority number one. It wasn't even in like the top 5, but based on the data, we're realizing that like that is where we should put our efforts to move the needle. Other companies, yeah, there's a lot of surprise. Like, some companies will be like, it's pay. And then we run the survey and it's like, it's not pay.
Can you give an example maybe of a surprise that you once encountered?
Yeah, I think, one of the things that's funny about culture surveys is people are always like, I want to put a pay question in there. And I'm like, you can do whatever you want. You're the client. I do not advise that, right? If you were going to ask me like, are you satisfied with your pay? Unless I started like a month ago, I'm probably going to say no, right? I'm not going to give like a 5 out of 5. It's like, if you're asking, I'd take more. So I don't ever advise on putting that in there. And I always say, if it's a problem, it will come up. Like there are open-ended questions, right? Where we say anything else or what would it take to keep you here? Trust me, if it's a problem, it's going to be a theme. Like people aren't just going to be like, okay, I'll bring this up at another time. So I think one of the biggest discrepancies is sometimes we see people are like, oh, it's going to be pay. And can you do like a competitive, like a comp analysis? And I'm like, first of all, no, that's not what I do. But if you need it, we'll find out through the survey. And then there's people who do that for a living and you should probably pull them in if it comes up that much. A lot of the times what we see is it's professional development. So people don't see a career path for themselves at the company. And while organizations are really focused on like, well, they don't think that we have competitive pay and they want more money. Yeah, of course people want more money. Like who's going to say, no, I'm good, but usually what we see is professional development, oftentimes relationships directly with the manager. Yeah. Sometimes something that comes up more often than you'd expect is like how decisions are made or how they're communicated. So it's always, I don't want to say funny, but like when we present those, we're like, and in the open-ended questions, pay came up 5% of the time, but only like, only 30% of people feel that they have a trajectory here to grow for the next 5 years.
Yeah. How have you tackled the challenge of then helping the business leaders really buy into the idea that it's worth investing in culture with
Yeah.
all of its intangibles, and that it's even possible to change it?
Great question. Probably an unconventional answer, to be totally honest, just because I am an entrepreneur. So like, I don't have to take on those projects if it's going to be an uphill battle. And
Smart.
you feel very like hesitant to say that. But one of the things I tell people all the time is like, the idea is to do business with people who believe what you believe. So if I'm going to come in there, if you tell me I want to run a culture analysis, and then I say, here are the things that we recommend that you measure, because we have a pretty standardized subset of questions. So we call it me, we, us. So we measure the individual level, the team level, and then the organizational level. So that really gives us like a pulse of everything going on, right? How do I see myself in the organization? How are my skills developed? But then how do I work within my team? That's also where we have like manager questions. And then how do I see the organization at large? Like, do leaders walk the talk? Do I believe in the mission? Do I know the mission? So if I present that and somebody has a reaction to it and they're like, well, we don't want to like ask, that question. If they don't believe what I believe, that we need to get to the actual root cause, it's probably not the right fit, and I sound more hesitant in that than like but fine, go work with somebody else. It's your dollars, it's my time, and also my integrity, right? Like if you're going to be measuring me on this, and then you're also going to be, telling people about it. And if you come back and say nothing changed, well, right, we didn't solve the right problem. So yeah, nothing changed. So I feel like from that sense, it's like unconventional in the sense that I can say, like, I don't really have to deal with that, which is really nice. And I've been very lucky to work with companies who are very great about wanting to assess their culture and being very intentional about it and knowing the return on it. So that is not something that I really have to, it's not an uphill battle for me. I will say, like, sometimes some of the results, nobody's ever had like a really bad reaction to the results, but more so surprised. And obviously, as you know, with like change management professionals, sometimes you just have to sit in that space with them, right? Like, okay, you thought that you had a really collaborative team, and we're finding, let's say we assess it and break it down by department, and we're finding that that's not really the case. What is that bringing up? Like, where is there truth to that? Where, and it's a lot easier with numbers, like people can't really refute the data. When we do qualitative analysis, it's a lot easier to be like, well, that's your perception. It's like, well, these are numbers. So, I thankfully, knock on wood, have not had any like very bad experiences, more so just difficult conversations, which I understand. When you manage a team, it's very personal to get feedback that you're doing anything that's not exemplary, right?
Yeah.
What do you
That's
think?
A good answer. This is the advantage of being an entrepreneur. I wish I don't know quite how you learned that lesson in only 2 years. Like that's very wise. I wish I could have talked to you like 8 years ago. There are definitely some clients I wouldn't have taken on. But I did not have that mindset. So very wise answer. What were you going to say, Tuli?
Well, I was just going to ask you, Shereen, what do you think that's all about? That discrepancy between what a manager thinks they know about their team, or what an organizational leader thinks they know about the organization, and what's actually going on?
This is such a loaded question. It's such a good one. Okay, let me preface by saying that I really like, if we look at it from this like appreciative lens, and we really think, let's give managers the benefit of the doubt, because honestly, being a manager is so hard, and less people want to be managers, and I do not blame them. It was very rewarding for me, but now when people are like, I want to be an individual contributor for life, I'm like, I support that. And I really understand where you're coming from. So let's give them like the benefit of the doubt that they really are doing the best that they can with the tools that they have. I think a lot of times managers feel like, I really have to lead with like this sense of optimism, and like, I don't want to say anything negative. And like, if I if I admit what's in front of me, then like that's negative. And so they take on this lens where like they lead with that positivity to think that they're protecting their team, right? The problem is your team sees a problem and thinks one of two things. They either think we have a problem and my manager doesn't know, which is a really big issue, or we have a problem and my manager knows, but thinks I'm too dumb to know. And so it's like, you kind of have this lose-lose scenario. So I think one of the like biggest hurdles is, and like managers are trying to solve this problem in a vacuum, right? So, let's say that people at the bottom, you have really high attrition or like you're hemorrhaging, and they're like, we don't want to ask the people at the bottom why they're leaving because we don't want to acknowledge that people are leaving. And it's like, but people know that their peers are leaving. So you either acknowledge it, or it continues to happen. And so then I think they try to solve this problem in this like echo chamber where, one person presents an idea and another one presents an idea, but really like without bringing in the person who is being affected, they aren't able to solve that problem. So, and I say that saying, I really think that they're doing the best that they can. And they're like, this is how we protect our people. This is how we remain optimistic. This is how we like, show people that we're going to move forward despite whatever, but it never works. I'm still like a little bit perplexed on why people still do that, but if you have an answer, let me know.
My mind just I'm deep in my capstone, right? That is about narratives. And so the first thing that came to mind is that there's still big, like overarching corporate narratives about what a good leader does. And we haven't, even though there are, authors out there and there's research out there about psychological safety and vulnerability and all of these things that are kind of trending, I don't think we're at the point where we've actually changed the narrative, right? Yeah. The capital N narrative about what a good leader does. And so even if they're listening to Simon Sinek and to Brene Brown and they're listening to Adam Grant and everything, it feels like you're going against bigger values to actually be vulnerable and admit that you did it. Because I think those leadership stories that we have, at least in the United States, have been going on for centuries.
And I will say too, like, listen, being a manager and asking somebody like, what do you want? That's really scary, because if they're like, I don't want to be in this role, I want to move to like X team. Okay, well, you're not a genie, so like asking somebody what they want is a very scary thing, right? If I'm like, what do you want for dinner? And you're like, I want authentic Colombian food. And I'm like, that doesn't exist in Chicago. And now I opened a box of worms. I mean, obviously it exists, but like now I opened this box of worms asking you what you wanted and I can't deliver on it. So I think there's this like really terrifying aspect of being a manager where it's like, as soon as I open my mouth and invite that conversation, I don't know what's going to come of it. And then like, it's almost like I can't claim ignorance. Not that I think that managers are trying to be ignorant, but it's like, once you know, then there's this added pressure of like, oh, now I know, and I don't know if I can solve that. With that said, I think there's so much power in, as a manager, saying, I totally hear you. I would like to get you one step closer to that, whatever that is. I don't know that I'm going to be able to solve that exact problem. Or here's what I know, here's what I can share, and here's what I can't share yet, but I will when I have details, right? It's like, I just want to feel, I just want to feel like I'm in the loop.
Mm-hmm. That's a great point.
Yeah. So I'm hearing you say that one quality that good managers share, or something that something that people can do to be a good manager, is to listen, and to really, really listen. Anything else come to mind that you've seen that really great managers do?
I think one thing that's like, that I'm always really impressed with, and it's top of mind because I was having a conversation with somebody about it yesterday, is if your organization is going through a major change, and it doesn't, what you like, what constitutes a major change for you is not necessarily what's a major change for somebody else, right? So let's say that, I'm a team manager and somebody below me leaves, and it's like, yeah, that's kind of a bummer, but like for the people who reported to that said person, that might be a really big change for them. So how do I like understand what's going on there, understand the magnitude of maybe that change for that person, and then what can I do? So even like, let's have 30-minute conversations twice a week, every morning, and let's just stop the rumor mill. Bring whatever questions you have. Let's have a very transparent conversation. I think there's a lot that happens, and obviously that's like a smaller scale change, right? Let's talk about, honestly, the context that this was in yesterday was in the context of WeWork. And, they were like, was like the great rise and then the great fall. And the person I was talking to, Sydney May, who was in the program, she mentioned that every morning for, I think, 30 minutes, as soon as everything happened with like the IPO, her manager set up time and said, here's what I can tell you. Here's what I can't tell you yet, but when I have more details and I'm able to share, I will tell you. And it's like, that to me is such a go slow to go fast model. Like from 9 to 9:30, you're having a conversation so that from 9:30 on, you can continue working. Whereas the teams that aren't having those conversations are spinning the rumor mill, they're spiraling, they're gossiping, right? And then it's like, you actually have like negative business implications.
Yeah. That's good to hear, because I mean, I guess with WeWork, it could depend on location, but I happen to know of certain WeWorks, and I'm a fan of WeWork. I use WeWork, but I happen to know of certain WeWorks where the culture is just incredibly toxic. So it sounds like a good practice.
Well, and it was interesting too, because it's like, her talking about WeWork, that was a really big part of her identity, but also just seeing like the way that was handled still gave her such a positive impression of the overall organization. When you guys know, we've all been through change where like the way it was handled changes everything about, right? Like everything that happened before it might as well be wiped clean because the ending was awful.
Right. Yeah. I want to uplift something that you said before, Alma, which is about narrative and one of the reasons why you're studying narrative. And I think for me, when I hear that, and something I've been reflecting on, is that it's just another way of saying that human beings are very, very complex, and we tell ourselves stories, and there are things that we believe based on our culture, and these things are not simple. There's no like simple answer. And that's why I think it's great, like by understanding a narrative, or a narrative that a team has, or a narrative that a company has, you get to understand something very complex. That's why it's one of the reasons why we love stories, isn't it?
I mean, it's our primary vehicle for making meaning of our life. Ours, as in all human beings. The way each human being in different cultures does it is perhaps a little bit different. But yeah, it's the main way that we make sense of things. And so going back to what you were saying, Shereen, about the rumor mill. So another principle that comes from, I guess you could say, the strands of psychology that are interested in narrative as an approach, is that human beings, when they only get certain pieces of a story, because all of our brains know that there's like a beginning, a middle, and an end, without getting into any big details. Like every story has characters, there's some type of conflict, and then something happens, there's an end. So the WeWork example you give is really powerful because of what that particular manager did, because it was, I don't know if he or she understood the principle, but basically, if we have parts of a story, we are incapable as human beings, right? We're basically incapable of not filling in the blanks somehow, right? And so we have to understand that human beings are making meaning of things. And so if you are a leader and there's this whole story going on about the IPO and everything, like the human beings on your team are not going to be like, oh, I'm not going to think about it and I'm just going to assume the best. No, we all just like, I think our brain just goes in and is like, bloop, 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 fill in the blank. And then of course, how tragic we are and how we fill in the blanks or whatever, that depends on other things, but we do it. And so that's why it's such a powerful thing for a leader to not shy away from difficult conversations and that transparency thing. Like try to give as much information as you can so that they don't have these big gaps, like you said, so that from 9:30 on, they're not filling in gaps. because which is why, I mean, just think about like when back in the day when we couldn't binge on Netflix and HBO and all of this, and we got a to be continued. Do you remember when you're watching? Do you remember the angst and anger of a to be continued?
It's honestly such a good, like, it's such a good way of framing it. And I said this earlier today to somebody. I said, in the absence of information, we fill in the gaps. And so it's like,
there it is. Yeah.
Right. You know, as much as you're like, just, you know, we've all heard like, just don't think about it or like breathe. It's like, oh, I never thought about that. I never thought about not thinking about the thing that was stressing me out. Thank you. That was like,
I'll press the off button. My bad.
Yeah. $1 million advice. You should absolutely be a coach. Never thought of that before. Thank you. Yeah, no, it's such a good point. And I could go on like a whole tangent about endings, but one of the other things I always say is like a great book can be ruined by a bad ending. And so how something ends, and I think about this even in terms of like leaving an organization, right? We always say like leave an organization better than you found it. It's like, how about an organization leaving a person better than they found it, right? And like, what do we do when we part ways, right? That's why we see so much scrutiny. I mean, look at Google, like Google, Meta, all of these companies are getting such scrutiny for how they parted with employees. And it's like, that really tarnishes the whole experience of like everything that led up to it. So that's my other, you know, book analogy, but it's
good. Thank you.
Narrative stuff is so interesting.
Yeah. That's great. If you have to do layoffs, and this is a whole other conversation, research shows that you should really try to avoid them to the best of your ability. It should really, really be. And then if you do have to do them, there's also a way to do them, right? Bob Sutton, Stanford, did a lot of research on this, and rarely is it done well. And that's for all sorts of reasons. People are scared. The legal department's involved, and all that. I'm curious if either of you have ever seen a layoff that was done well, and if so, how was it done?
I have not seen a layoff done well, and I will echo your sentiment. There is so much research that layoffs are actually, they do not benefit the company in any way. Like, they tarnish reputation. They lead to mental health issues, which eventually leads to economic issues, which is why you're doing layoffs in the first place generally, right? But also there's no return on profit. It's like immediately maybe your investors are like happy, or, you know, the board is happy, but there's no like longevity, there's no gain. So I echo your sentiment there. I would say, have I seen layoffs done well? No. But have I seen other options exercised instead of layoffs? Absolutely. I mean, if you look at Southwest, when they were looking, I think like during COVID, they were looking at laying people off. They turned to their employees and said, here's what we have to do. What are some of our other options? Right. Yeah. Or there are companies that have done furloughs. They furlough the entire company. Right. So when my husband was during COVID, his company furloughed everybody for 20%. So everybody took a 20% pay cut, and they had one day off a week. And they basically operated under this model of like, it's better that all of us hurt a little than some of us hurt a lot. And it's like, that's another great option, because eventually, and we'll see it, these companies bounce back and then they have to fill all of those roles. And that's also very costly. So That didn't answer your question about if I've seen layoffs done well, but there are a lot of other options other than layoffs. And it's very hard for me to wrap my mind around.
I totally agree. I've been thinking about this a lot. And, you know, my current way of thinking about layoffs is that it's like cutting off a limb. You know, sometimes people have to get amputated for some reason, you know, and I mean, it's the last resort, right? No one wants to lose, God forbid, a hand.
Should be the last resort.
It's absolutely the last resort, but sometimes it has to be done to save a person's life. So sometimes, and again, this is really, really last resort. A company will have to do some layoffs in order to save the company. You know, but how it's done, I mean, and there are ways to do it, you know, transparency and with compassion. And you know, I know Airbnb did a lot of layoffs, did a big layoff at the beginning of COVID, because Airbnb, you know, they thought they weren't going to survive. And this is, before everyone realized like, oh, I could do COVID from wherever, and then they started thriving again. But like one thing they did is they took their whole hiring department and assigned them to help find jobs for everyone that was laid off. I mean, that's pretty amazing, or stuff like that. But
yeah, and a lot of companies will offer like those career services and stuff like that. But to your point, it should be it should be like an amputation, like last resort. But how, it's funny because people are like, well, what else do you want them to do? It's like, there's a lot of other options, actually.
Yeah.
I haven't seen exercise prior to cutting your limb off. So there actually are other things you can do, right?
100%. 100%. Let's talk a little bit more about toxic cultures. You brought that up. I feel like that term is thrown around a lot. This is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. I wrote my capstone on toxic cultures, and in a sense, and talk to us about that a little bit. How do you think about a toxic culture? What is a toxic culture?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because right now there's so much research about cultures, which like it was coming anyway, but obviously COVID just like catapulted us in that direction. Now there's a lot of research, which if you listen to any, like if you hear toxic culture, you hear about Donald and Charles Saul. They did this research on toxic cultures, and it's like lack of respect and anger and all of these attributes. And it's like, makes it seem like toxic cultures are like this outlier. Like we think about them as like yelling and like flipping tables and, like pounding on like boardroom tables. And
well, one second. Is that, I'm sorry to interrupt, but yeah. Are we talking about a toxic manager or like a toxic person, or like, because those examples of like yelling, is it that, oh, this is a place where just people yell all the time, or are we talking about like a toxic employee, a toxic manager, perhaps?
I mean, I think there's a lot of, when I'm talking about toxic organizations in general, I think when we picture toxic organizations, that's sort of what we picture. Like we picture these extremes. So it's not necessarily like one person or one manager, but we think about like walking into work and like no one says hi and, whatever. It's like all, you have this like, at least for me, I have this vision in my head of like what a toxic culture is, right? And if you think about like, let's go back to basic relationships, which really that is what an organization is on a much larger scale. So I always tell people in org change, like I want you to think about anything as a relationship that is two people or more, because you can really apply change principles to anything that's more than one person. Well, you can apply to individuals, but yeah. If you think about like a traditional relationship and we say, oh, that person's in a toxic relationship, you think about like, I don't want to like say anything that's going to have this like trigger warning, but like yelling and, whatever, I'm not going to go there, but you can sort of fill in the blanks in your mind. There's a whole other element of like the emotional side to that, right? Like somebody's partner saying like, are you sure you want to wear that? And you'd be like, that is, that is toxic, but it's a way more subtle toxic.
Right.
And that starts to slowly chip away at you. Right. And so I think we're there with relationships, but we don't think about organizations in that sense. Like we're like, oh, somebody yelled at me or they disrespected me, and maybe this is a manager relationship, but maybe that's the norm at the organization if we're thinking about it from like this toxic culture perspective. What about cultures where like you present an idea and somebody says no, and your manager says no, and then they present it a week later as if it's their idea, right? When we think toxic culture, we don't necessarily think about that scenario. Or I present an idea 15 times, different ideas, and you say, it's not really how we do things around here, but like, keep trying, sweetie, right? It's like, those are like subtly toxic cultures where you start to get this, I think about it like a slow drip. Obviously, I'm a very visual person now. I have an analogy for everything, but like,
yes, love it. I'm on board. Like, I love it.
Slow drip of losing yourself, right? Like, okay, my ideas aren't good enough. And like, they keep telling me to come to the table with this, but then they don't do that. And I think there's a lot of like subtle toxicity in organizations that don't walk the talk. And there's no, people ask me this all the time. Is there a right way to do culture? No, look at Bridgewater, right? They have a radical, radical feedback system where we could be in a meeting. I'll say, Alma, you're not really showing up. Like, I give your performance here a D. In another culture, that would actually be toxic. But at Bridgewater, that's very normal. So
right.
You talk about like, we're
Love Bridgewater.
Yeah, it's not for me. I would cry all the time, but like, I respect it, right? Because when you go into the interview, they're not like, we give you feedback sandwiches when we want to give feedback. We're going to say something really nice. It's like they tell you this is our model. But if you go into an organization and they're like, oh, we are bottom up innovation, we always listen to people at the bottom, whatever it is, we have so much respect, we never cut people off, and then they don't do that.
Yeah.
You start to think it's a reflection of you, right? Because it's not transparent. So I think the problem with those organizations is, and even when you think about like your friends, when they're in relationships where like their significant other yells, they kind of know, like, yeah, he, like, that person's like a little, like whatever. But when it's so subtle, you become a shell of yourself. And then you're like, I don't really know where it went wrong. And I think that happens to way more people than we think, because we say like, it's a toxic culture and we have this idea of what it is, but there's so many other more subtle versions of what that looks like.
Oh yeah, that's so powerful. I'm so glad we touched on this topic. I also think a lot about subtly toxic cultures where boundaries, work-life balance boundaries are just like, I think that a place where, personally, I think that if your boss, or the person you report to, writes you at 9 p.m., and I mean, unless you're working in a factory or something, but a standard 9 to 5 job, right? I think that's already indicative of, writes you about work, right? Mm-hmm. Writes you about work at 9 p.m. or asks for something, or sends emails at 3 a.m. and expects others, or you start seeing people working at crazy hours and they don't even like, you can change the send time if you really had to work at a crazy time. You know what I mean? I do that all the time. I do it all the time. Yeah. Sometimes I'm like, crap, I didn't get to it. I'm not letting anyone know that I was on the computer at 9 p.m. I'm sorry.
Alma,
then they'll think that they can talk to me at that time. No, you can't.
Alma, do you do what I do and set it not for 7:30, but for 7:33, like random,
or like 8:32.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh my God, I would set it for like 5:30. I'd be like, I'm the most productive person. Like, I'm up when really I'm like, I'm in REM at that time, but I'm like, I want you to think that I have full,
So it can be used either way to shape your image. Is our point, right?
That's my narrative. That's not actually what happens, but I'm like, I am a morning person, when in reality, I'm a lunchtime person. I peak from like 12 to 2, and then I'm like pretty much used, not a morning person, not a night person.
So we're getting you now post peak.
Yeah.
But you're doing great, by the way.
90% of the time. I think it's funny because I have such a reaction to the like late night sending, and this is so, I know this is not normal, because I used to do that. Like, I would message my team. I think my team members would say the same, because I still like go to dinner with them all the time and I'm very close with them. But like, that was never my expectation. And they knew that, like, even if I saw them on late, I'd be like, why are you doing this? Sometimes as a manager, your day does not start until like 3 p.m., and
that's legit.
And I think it's totally, and I like go back and forth on this all the time, because I'm like, man, I sent so many late night emails, and
you were young.
Yeah. Not that young, but I mean, I wish I had better boundaries, but it's a really interesting, it's funny, because at a job, I got an invite once. It was like 11 p.m. for like an 8 o'clock in the morning meeting. And at the time I was in California, right after my husband and I got married. We spent like 3 months there, and I worked Central Time. And so my day would start at 7 a.m. This meeting was at 6 a.m. Naturally, it was COVID. If my day started at 7 a.m., I was waking up at like 6:55. Like, I wasn't up, and, that's why I would use the early morning feature if I did. Yeah. I literally got yelled at like, I can't believe you weren't on the call. That was like so irresponsible. I'm like, you sent the email at 11 p.m. Like
No.
you sent the calendar invite at 11 p.m. Also, like,
No.
listen, I'm totally like, you have my number. If you are sending an email for a meeting post hours before the day even starts, send me a text and be like,
Absolutely.
hey, I hate to do this. And I know that it's early for whatever it is, but it's like the fact that I mean, it was like an argument. I was like, I'm struggling to apologize in this scenario because like, no, that's just like, no.
Yeah.
And that is like this like subtly toxic, and that was an extreme example. Like those conversations don't happen often, but yeah, no, I'm not doing that.
Yeah.
Sorry for that.
No, good. I also think of, okay, so violating kind of work-life boundaries. And yes, as far as what time you send emails and everything, I think there's a lot of different ways to work, but it's more about the expectations and what is like what behaviors are prized or allowed in an organization and what behaviors are like, hey, I'm flagging this isn't, but I think a lot about I've seen lots of passive aggressive behavior that's very subtle. You don't know, are they doing that to me or it just happened that way?
Yeah, can I give you an example of that?
Oh yeah, of course.
Like one thing, and I wonder what both of you think about this, but one thing that has irked me in the past is when if a manager sends just a calendar invite to a meeting without any context or explanation, all of a sudden you come to this meeting and you're like, what am I in trouble? That's always what I think, right? Did I do something wrong?
Should I pack up my stuff on the way over?
Exactly. Like what's the deal? Like and so what I've tried to do, I mean, if I ever, it's just to be very explicit. I want to meet with you tomorrow about X.
Yeah.
That's it. I mean, that's all it takes.
Clear communication. Yep.
And I think that's also knowing the person that's sitting in front of you, right? Like anybody who's managed me knows that like, and I tell people this all the time, I can swirl myself into another universe. Like I could be on Mars by the time you get a hold of me with stories that I've made up. So like
back to that. Yeah.
Yeah. An invite like that would send me into the orbit. Like and so it's like, but maybe somebody who has that type of communication style, you can send that and they're like, okay, yeah, this person probably just wants to chat about whatever. It's like you
if that's the norm, yeah.
In front of you, right? So yeah, if somebody did that to me, I'm like, no. I need to know like in the next 5 minutes, what is this meeting about? And they're like, oh, I'm just rescheduling our one-on-one. I'm like, if I didn't ask you, I wouldn't have slept tonight. I would have been up all night, like freaking out, night terrors.
It's no joke. Yeah.
Fine.
So in your experience now working with companies or when you were working at a company as an employee, how are you trying to help? You mentioned that you work with leadership development. So how do you approach this topic of helping either leaders or employees or business leaders like really give more weight to subtle toxicity within organizations?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I honestly have not had this conversation with organizations. Honestly, this has been more so personal conversations. I think the funny thing is a lot of the people I've been having this conversation with are millennials who are seeing like Gen Z not being afraid of job hopping, and millennials are like, if I leave my CV, my resume, I don't know why I just called it a CV. I've never called it a CV. My resume, and it's like, okay, but you're a shell of yourself. Like, why would you stay at an organization if you know that this is like bad for your mental health? So in terms of like having that conversation with organizations, I can't think of an instance where I've actually like called it by that name. I also don't, ever want to like call out an organization. One of the biggest things that I see that I think contributes to this like subtly toxic culture thing that a lot of people do unintentionally is how they communicate decisions that are made. And so it's very interesting to think about, if you come into a room and say, I've made this okay, like I'm like, Alma, I found this restaurant, let's get sushi. Are you interested? And I like already booked a reservation and put a down payment down, right? And you're like, no, I'm really feeling that Colombian food that I mentioned. And I'm like, well, sorry, but like, that's not really an option. It's like, why did you ask me for my input then?
Yeah.
There's like, how do you communicate something where you're not looking for input? Where you can say, we're going through this change. I'm here if you want to talk about these things, or like, what concerns do you have? Right. And then I think about the other end of it. It's like, if you're in a burning building, you're gonna be like, Alma, would you rather take like the stairs on the east side or the stairs on the west side? So it's like there's this like continuum of decision making. And I think leaders who are not privy to that, and honestly, most are not, get really hung up on that because they're like, I want to ask my team about it. It's like, but why would you want to solicit feedback on something that you can't do anything about?
Yeah.
And I think that also contributes to that culture, right? It's like, if I come to you, and I know this is such a silly example, but I'm like, do you want, like, are you in the mood for sushi? And you're like, no. And I'm like, well, it doesn't matter. That's what we're doing.
Exactly.
Like, okay, well, obviously, like, my weight doesn't mean anything in this, so it's like little things like that where managers probably do not, and I'm not even just saying managers, because honestly, how you communicate a decision is probably also part of the culture, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
These little things that companies don't really know that they're doing, but it's like, when you know better, you can do better. And in those situations, I always ask people, like, how would you want to be communicated about a decision like this? Like, we make these things so complicated, right? Like, we're like, I'm gonna like ask, I'm gonna come with like 15 questions. It's like, you're a human being and you're talking to another human being. If this was you, what would you want? I'd want them to tell me the truth. Okay, why don't we try telling you? Like, hey, Alma, I know that you totally might not be in the mood for sushi, but I totally forgot that I already put, I put this down payment down, whatever it is. And I can't get it back. And I'm so sorry. And I hope that that's fine with you. And next time you can pick the restaurant. Okay. Isn't that such a better approach than being like, are you in the mood? No, I'm not. Well, too bad.
That's a great example.
I just wanted to go back to the Colombian food.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting because ultimately, like, the way to say that there's a toxic culture, right? That's not like I'm trying to think about how to phrase this, but that's not a tangible thing. It's not like saying, and I'm holding a pen, this is a pen. Mm-hmm. A culture, I think, and I'd love to hear what you think about this, but it has to do with the perception of the people that are there, especially when it's toxic, right? When it's not pleasant. And I think what you're saying is really, really important, because ultimately it's the way we experience a place is made up of often very, very small experiences that we have throughout the day. How someone talks to us, anything. Right, in any way. So I think that's really, really important. And what I find is that sometimes that is something managers are not really aware of, because sometimes when they think about culture, they think about, oh, here are the perks. We have foosball in the break room. We have kombucha on tap. We are so cool. And hey, I'm all for the kombucha. That's wonderful. But the way people actually experience culture is, were you treating them with respect? How did you talk to them? How did they feel at the end of the day? Were they engaged in their work? Those are far more important than foosball.
Yeah. Yeah. And the foosball thing, it's so funny because the last company I worked at had a foosball table and I was there for 6 years, and the only time I ever touched it was probably like passing somebody in the hall, like unintentionally ran into it, but 6 years, never once. Yeah. The interesting thing too about managers, and one of the big things that I always ask when we do communication, and that's always something that I do in like leadership development workshops, is who gets to assess how effectively the communicator communicates. Is it the sender or the receiver? And it's always fun because there's usually a debate, but I would love to
obviously it's the receiver. No.
Obviously it's the sender. I'm kidding. It's the receiver.
It's really interesting because people are like, it really does usually spark like a good conversation, right? And so then it's like, okay, let's take this to extreme terms. If you were playing catch, you would probably throw the ball to some, like I would throw it differently to Alma than I would like a 2-year-old, right?
Yes.
So like if I threw a ball at a 2-year-old, like I would throw it at Alma, that's my fault that they didn't catch it, right? Or, you know, thinking of like a sender and a receiver, if I speak to you perfectly in French, but you don't speak French, that's my problem. That's not your problem. So I know those are like very extreme examples, but it's really interesting to think about, like, I have to think about the person who's in front of me so that I can tailor how I am showing up. And a lot of the times we don't do that. And that does contribute to culture, right? Like if you, I have like what's called a facilitating style, but very, you know, like I want to know how your weekend was. I want you to say hello to me. I want you to ask me how, if you come and sit down and you just like sit down and this is our agenda, I'm going to spend the next 30 minutes. I'm going to be orbiting. Like, I'm going to think you're mad at me. And then I'm not going to be able to do anything. Right. So it's like, how can we think about the person who's in front of us? And the idea is not to become that person, but the idea is, how do I take one step closer to you? And how can you maybe take one step closer to me? Okay, maybe we don't do small talk for 10 minutes. Maybe we do it for 5 and then we start the meeting. But understanding the person who's in front of you and learning to communicate a little bit more in their style, that contributes to culture too.
Yeah.
100%.
It's complicated. It's hard working with humans. Being a human is hard.
I think one of the reasons why this is so challenging is because in a workplace, the job is to get the work done. And that is the top priority of everyone, right? And the challenge is that that we don't really have, I don't know if we don't have time, but we don't do a lot of thinking about how we work. We just do the work. And when we don't do that, we all have our own kind of autopilot. And that autopilot is combined with lots of things. It's our own experiences. It's how we were treated. It's our own fears. It's our own psychology. It's certainly our own narratives. Probably, that probably encompasses it all. But if we're not aware of them, then it's very, very difficult. So what I'm really saying here is that this is why I think the work that you do, Shereen, and hopefully the work that we're all involved with, is so important, because in essence, one of the things we're trying to do is say, let's pause for a second and let's think about how you're doing the work. And I get that you don't necessarily have capacity to do that because you're busy getting your work done, but that's why you brought me in here. And I'm really happy to help you do that. Does that resonate?
Yeah. And McKinsey just put out this report, and they surveyed like 1,500 companies across various industries, and they looked at them from like 4 different categories. So they had people and performance, obviously it's like ideal, and then performance driven companies, and people driven companies, and then just like regular. So I don't know, like control, right?
Yeah,
and
robots.
So
Robots.
Well, so they looked at like performance I think they looked at it from 10 years. So if for 9 years you were like profitable, they considered you like a performance. You had like some performance-based, model. And then they assessed people on 3. It was like rewards. I'm totally going to butcher it, even though I was reading it last night. Whatever. You guys can read the research. What they did then is looked at it on 6 subscales. So they looked at profitability. The companies that were performance focused and people in performance focused were the same in terms of profitability. Then they looked at profitability from a resilience perspective. So how do they deal with like volatility, COVID, and consistency? How likely were they to continue to perform? This was all based on profit, right? The companies who were people and performance based outweighed all of the other companies on every single subscale. The only one that they were like neck and neck with was performance-based companies on like the actual like EBITDA. And so it's like the data actually exists that if you do the work through the people, you are more profitable as a company. There's no doubt that you can be profitable and have a terrible culture and people who are miserable. the question is, how much more profitable can you be? I mean, that's not why we should be doing the work, but organizations do exist to make money. So like, how much better could it be if people were engaged, if they were happy, if they were heard, if, you know, I could rattle off a million things. So,
and it's certainly not, and you're certainly not worse off. That's the thing also, right?
Yeah.
So,
right. Well, I think that the idea is like, well, if we invest in people, it costs us money. And is there going to be a return? And it's like, yeah, there is going to be a return. And they found that the organizations that were people and performance-based spent, I think it was 74 hours annually average. Some companies were like up to 120 hours on professional development. So it's like, yes, it is an investment, but then look at the return for the company. So I think people are like, well, if we spend money on it, you know, it's like you maybe we will be worse off. It's like, no, there's no data that supports that you're going to be worse off.
That's fantastic.
It's a really great study. You guys should read it. And I totally like butchered how they did it, but I read it last night and I was like, this is fascinating. And this answers every question I ever get asked about org change. And I love it. I'm just going to, you know, send it to everyone now.
Yeah, it's the report we've been waiting for. I
mean, honestly, it's like fascinating. It was in my newsletter today. No big deal. But now I know you didn't read it.
Of course I did, because Tuli sent it to me.
Oh, Tuli.
I read it on the bus over. Yep.
Oh my God. Really you guys. Good.
Yeah.
Nicest ever.
What do you think this is? All right. So I know we're probably nearly out of time, but I'd be remiss if we didn't ask you about Gen Z. You write and you do a lot of work with Gen Z. Who are they? Why do you care about them? What's the story?
Guys, Gen Z, like, they have it rough. I genuinely feel actually very bad for them. If you think about like how the rep that like millennials got, right? Like, oh, so entitled. We've done this same song and dance every time a new generation enters the workforce. So like, I'm perplexed by why organizations are so perplexed, but nonetheless, here we are. And it's great because that's what keeps us in business. But
yeah,
Gen Z. So God, there's just so much.
Can we start with definition? What year do you have to be born in to be considered Gen Z?
Oh yeah.
Honestly, there's a lot of different, like,
it's already controversial.
It honestly is. No, it really is like very controversial. I mean, some people will say that it starts in like 96. I usually say 96, like January 1, 96, you're Gen Z. It could end in 2012. Some people are like, but it's still going on. So let's just say, for the sake of this conversation, we'll say through like 2012.
Okay.
So a lot of these people are entering the workforce right now. And first of all, they're dealing with like the backlash that we've all dealt with as millennials, like, oh, you're so entitled, you're so blah, blah, blah. But there's so much more about them that companies don't understand. And I think one of the issues is they're like riding on the back of millennials. And as millennials, we were job hoppers. So, you know, if we didn't find what we were looking for, we were told to like seek passion and purpose and whatever, like we looked elsewhere. Gen Z was, for the most part, raised by Gen X. So Gen X, also known as the forgotten generation.
Who are they?
I forgot about them.
They like entered the workforce and were like starting families, buying homes during the 2008 recession, where most of them lost over 50% of their income. So growing up as Gen Z, and I think the oldest Gen Z at the time would have been 9 or 11. And growing up in, you know, with those conversations around the dinner table, that's really different than how I grew up with boomer parents who were in like a booming economy, who were like, oh, passion and like, love your job. And, you know, it's possible and whatever. It's like, they grew up being like, jobs are for money. And so as a result of having that rhetoric growing up, that narrative, right? Jobs are for money. And like, this company owes me nothing. They're way more serious. They're way more stressed. They have a totally different view of what jobs are. And so they're willing to give loyalty to organizations but the right organizations. And so it's really interesting because right now, one of the biggest issues is they're looking for professional development, but organizations are still thinking about the millennial aspect of like, well, why should I invest in early development if this generation is going to leave? It's like, but they're not going to leave if you give them what they need. So they're like totally keeping employers on their toes, and they can't retain them. They can't recruit them. Forget about retaining them. They can't recruit them. And then when they do recruit them, they're finding that they've been like duped. And so 8 in 10 think it's okay to leave an organization within 6 months if the job is not as advertised. I have been duped by a job before. I assume the two of you have been duped by a job description before.
I mean, duped. I don't take job descriptions seriously. I mean, I hope no future employers are watching this, but I know that that's just what they think they need, or they might need, or they got someone to write. So yeah, anyway, but yeah, certainly I've been in jobs where, was not as advertised.
Right. Well, and I think the other thing that's really interesting about Gen Z is they're the most diverse generation to date. And so like 25% of them are Hispanic, 20% of them are first generation college students. So I struggled adjusting to the workforce. I know I'm very open with this story, but like when I walked into the workforce, they're like, EBITDA, P&L, and I'm like, I know amygdala and like myelin sheath and like, I know how neurons, but like, I don't know any of these terms. I could go home and have a conversation with my parents who are both college educated, and I still struggled entering the workforce. When you go home and your parents are not college educated, those probably are not the conversations that you're having. And as a result, like you already start as, like there's already not a level playing field. And then you don't know how to get mentors. You don't know who to turn to for these things. So it's like, that's a major piece of it. And a lot of this generation, only 20% have had part-time jobs before. So for me, like I worked in a karate studio, which is hysterical to anyone who knows me. I know. Wow. I just was like washing.
Do you do karate?
No. I was like cleaning up after kids and like wiping the windows and whatever. But I started that at 16, and then I worked in retail, and then I worked at a Pilates studio. And so it's like, I've always been customer facing. For Gen Z, a lot of them were told, college admissions were down, competition was up, get the grades to get into the school, and then get the grades to get the job. And so a lot of them haven't even had part-time jobs before. So when they're entering your organization, that's the first time they're ever dealing with customers, might be the first time they're ever collaborating on something that's not a college project, And so we're like, oh, they're so entitled, they're such babies. And it's like, they're not. Like, this is... if you have to like understand them to be able to have that sort of empathy for the scenario that they're in. And then I'll stop talking about it for like 30 seconds. They're the most stressed and most serious generation to date. And like, if you think about this from, they grew up with phones in their hands. Okay. Well, when we think about what that really means, think about like when our parents were growing up, they had to catch the news on the radio at 6 p.m. And oh, by the way, it was like 3 days old, right? By the time you got that news. And for us, obviously it was more up to date, but like my parents, before we had DVR, it was like, we have to catch the 6 o'clock news. My mom still does that. I don't know why, but regardless, they have like the information in the palm of their hands. So like what's happening in Ukraine, what's happening in other countries, they're live streaming that. Right? Like they can go on Facebook Live and see that actually happening. It's not something where like you're just watching TV and it's like in this foreign country and you don't really know anyone there and you're never going to know anyone there. And it's like, yeah, they grew up with that. They grew up, they were born after Columbine. Yeah, I would be serious and stressed too, if that's all I knew, So it's like, if we think about the generation and like the world that they've come into, none of this should be surprising. So I'm like obsessed with them because I'm like, you guys are so misunderstood and it's so sad. And I had trouble adjusting to the workforce. And, there were a lot of scenarios where I could have been set up to succeed better than I was, I think. And the onus is on the organizations. I think it's a two-way street, right? We're going to commit to setting you up to succeed. And in return, hopefully you are committed to succeeding. If we don't set you up to succeed and then you don't, we can't really be surprised.
Yeah. That's fantastic. So how are you so you're clearly very passionate. How are you tackling this? Like, you mentioned a class that you're doing, and what else are you trying to do to help this generation and organizations understand?
Yeah. So I have an 8-week course that is, the front half is essentially business basics. And so sort of the whole impetus for this was I was having a conversation with somebody and they were like, I'm managing Gen Z and they're not up to speed. And this is just like crazy. I'm spending all this time doing it. So I did a ton of research. I interviewed Gen Z, anybody who had joined the workforce in the last 2 years, and then managers of people who had joined the workforce in the last 2 years. And I basically asked, I asked Gen Z, what do you wish you had learned sooner? What could have been streamlined? What were the biggest gaps? And then same with managers. Like, as a manager, someone's like, oh, can I ask you a question for 15 minutes? It's like, how am I going to answer what EBITDA is in 15 minutes, or like what P&L is, or how
But just for the record, I do not know what EBITDA is.
Honestly, most people don't. Most people don't know what EBITDA is. And I think like there's this whole idea of like Gen Z and millennials want to understand how they fit into the larger picture of an organization, right? So like not just a cog in a machine, but when I do something, how does it contribute to like how my company makes money? How, like how I'm getting paid, even little things like I got promoted. Why didn't you give me 30%? It's like, because we pull from a pool of money. It's not just an arbitrary number. It's like, even that framing is helpful, right? So like, how do businesses operate? And then this back half of the course is really, what does it mean to lead? What does it mean to lead myself early in my career? So how do I have difficult conversations? Because that's one of the things that I always hear, oh, Gen Z doesn't like conflict. Okay, well, how did you learn how to deal with conflict in an organization, right? Probably by happenstance, having a boss or seeing somebody do it. If you're not teaching them how to deal with conflict, that's not really something they've ever dealt with before. Also, they may have never had coworkers before. So how do we really, the whole idea is like, how do we level the playing field for Gen Z? It's obviously a recruitment tactic. It's a retention tactic because we all know that professional development leads to retention, but also your managers are the ones paying the price for Gen Z not being up to speed, right? It's like a lot of the managers I talked to were like, my day doesn't start till 3 p.m. because I'm answering like the same questions over and over that could absolutely be streamlined. And so it's like, what are we doing? Especially in this economy where like there's a labor shortage and there's a war on talent and all of these things. It's like, it's this whole idea of like, go slow to go fast. Like, how do we get back to, I don't know, like, how do we invest in people so that they can then in turn invest in us as an organization?
Right. So the course is for Gen Zers, but you go directly to the business.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So it would be people within a business. Okay.
Yeah. So we talk about things at like a high level, right? So like, how do businesses make money? What are businesses here for? Also, how can you think about like businesses critically? How do I assess my organization? Even little things like you can set up Google alerts for when your company is in the news, or like when your competitors are in the news, or when your clients are in the news. Like, how do I think more critically about the things that I'm actually working on? Right. And so that part is also tailored. So then your company comes in and says, this is how our company makes money. This is how we operate. So, normally in like an onboarding process, you're like, these are our tools and like, this is our culture. And like, everybody gets like confetti and you're like, okay, first of all, 90% of that went over my head and it doesn't help me do my job at all. And so the idea is like giving this context, and then back half, same thing. It's like we talk about a lot of really basic principles like communication, leadership, even little things like time management skills, which but inbox organization, if that's what a company wants. But then the company can also tailor that aspect of it too, to say like, these are the values, or like, these are some of the things that we want to tailor. We can bring in panelists, so it's pretty much like 80% baked and then 20% like iterative to the company, because the idea is that it should not be this huge heavy lift. So yeah. And it's research, so can't refute the data.
Nice.
Well, you could refute it with other data, but no, not your data.
Let me know when you find it.
I had an interesting conversation on Saturday with some friends, and the topic was like, how important is content in school? Or, another way to phrase it is, what is more important? Is it, is school really about content, or is it about skills? And I'm curious about how you think about it when not just with this Gen Z workshop, but with all the workshops. Like, of course, and everyone agrees that content is somewhat important, right? No one thinks that you should be taught, things that aren't true or things that are detrimental or, anything. But how do you think also about like skills? What kind of skills are you imparting on them? Or like, is there a way of thinking that you're trying to help them with? Or yeah, how do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and something that like I try to be super, super, super intentional about, because I've gone to workshops. Like anytime somebody hears like, oh, workshop or training, they're like, oh my God, the bane of my existence. Right. And it's like, if you have somebody sitting in front of you for 2 hours, if I go to a workshop and I don't walk away learning anything about myself, which by the way, everyone is their own favorite topic, right? So how do I make sure that you have some sort of, maybe not like epiphany, obviously epiphany is like this very dramatic word about it, but some element of self-awareness where I'm learning about myself in this session, how I show up, how I can better show up. Definitely some element of that. And I think that the content is really a vehicle for doing that, right? Like, what is it that's going to help people have that? So I do think it's way more about the skills, but it's working backwards. Like, what kind of skills are we trying to master in this? And what do we need to be able to do that? And how is the content going to fuel that conversation? So I don't ever start with the content. I always start with, what are we trying to accomplish? What would success look like? Okay, what are the skills that we need to get here? What's the content that will help us have that conversation? So I think the content is important, but the content should be a vehicle to get to wherever you're trying to go, right?
Sure. Yeah, because you could also give them the content like on a piece of paper or something,
Right. And it's funny because as an entrepreneur too, you are buying, like, sounds really weird to say this, but like, you are buying me, right? Like, you are buying my personality to come into your organization and like facilitate the discussion in the way that I'm going to facilitate it, right? Like, anytime you're paying for somebody to come into a workshop, you're paying for that. I can give you all of the content. You can have somebody run it. I don't know how it's going to land,
probably not that great. Hire Shereen immediately.
Well, thanks. But I think it's, to your point, it's like, yeah, you can have all the content, but if you don't have like the skills to be able to also make it stick, right? Like, somebody can show you a video, and if that's it, and there's no reflection or conversation or whatever after, it's like, okay, I just watched a video and now I'm going to carry on with my life.
Story of my life. Anyway.
Story of most workshops that you've probably been to.
Yeah.
No, and I don't mean it in that way, but I think it's that idea of like, what are we trying to get to versus like starting with the content.
Very interesting. I feel like there's a lot more to unpack here, maybe for a part 2. Alma, you wanna go ahead with the last question?
Oh yes. Okay. So our last question is this has been fascinating. We've talked about a lot. It's been fun. So our question is, dear Shereen, what have you been curious about lately?
Oh, what have I been curious about? I have been very curious about, it's work related. Is that okay?
Sure.
Is it supposed to?
It is. It can be anything related, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it could be like how to get your cat to stop getting in the toilet. I mean, I
am really curious about that. I'm a little worried it's an old age thing, but like, I'll tend to her after this. I'm almost like, I don't even want to tell people I'm curious about this, because when Adam Grant hears this podcast, then like, he's going to do the research on it. I'm very curious about the role that culture plays in relation to managers. So I've been thinking a lot about, I know.
No, I'm just wondering if you read my capstone or not. And if so,
Wait, no, because remember I ghosted you because a really solid.
I erased that from my mind. No, anyway, sorry.
I want to know, maybe this answers the question.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I'm very curious in talking to people who have left an organization in the last, whatever it is, 6 months. What has more weight? Is it the relationship with the manager, or is it a culture? So if I had a great relationship with my manager, but I couldn't see myself progressing at the culture, or like progressing within the organization because of the culture, or because they don't promote professional development, does that carry more weight than my relationship with a manager? Because I think there's so much emphasis and like pressure that we put on managers. Obviously, there's that Gartner study that's like 70, or Gallup study, 70% of variance in teams is due to the manager, right? It's like, it's a lot of pressure for a manager, but a manager can only do so much. And so I've been spending a lot of time thinking about, probably too much time thinking about that, honestly. Like, how much weight does a manager really have versus a culture? Because I've had good managers, and not the previous job, but the one before, I had an amazing manager, but I left because I was like, there's no progression opportunity for me here, and I don't see myself here, right? And so I just hear from a lot of managers who are like, oh, my team left and it's a reflection of me. And it's like, is it a reflection of you? So that was a very long-winded answer of what I'm curious about. And I guess all I really think about is org stuff. So that's what I'm curious about right now.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question. And but I have to say, it didn't sound like so much like you were talking about culture, because whether or not I can see myself at this company, down the road, or whether I think that there are growth opportunities. Is that a culture question?
I think so. I mean, I think culture is everything, right? It's like looking at the leadership team. It's like, do I want to be a leader here? That's culture.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Do you invest in your people? That's culture. So it's like, to what extent, like, how much weight does a manager have? Because at some point, there's stuff they can't control.
Yeah. No, I totally get that. But like, I'm thinking of an example. I was talking to someone recently who worked for a business that is owned by a family. It's very much a family business, but this person was not part of that family. And so they knew that there is a ceiling to how high they could climb in this company, because their last name wasn't, whatever the last name was. Sater. No, I'm just kidding.
I was waiting for that. I was like, who's gonna say
it? But I think it's a great question. I think that's something that's really interesting to think about. And thanks for sharing that with us. And thank you so much for spending all of this time and for sharing your wisdom and knowledge, and bringing your curiosity and sharing it with us and our millions of viewers all over the world.
Thank you. And this was so fun. This was like, didn't even feel like a podcast. I don't even want to hang up.
All right, I'm hanging up. Bye.
I know. I hope Adam Grant doesn't grab my research and like run with it. So
maybe he'll invite you to research with him.
Yeah, wouldn't you want AJ to do that?
Yeah, but is he gonna invite me, or like is he just gonna take it? And I mean, I'm not saying that he would do that, but I'm like, he's gonna be like, wow, such a brilliant idea, Shereen, that I'm gonna claim it as my own.
Yeah, I mean, Adam first would quote about 5.5 studies that are already out there, and then he would tell you, and then he would sharpen the question, and then he'd invite you.